I mean, I have some sympathy to that in terms of, moral intuitions that people have that I deeply lack. The idea of desert is just, I've never found any of that compelling. But I think, imagine someone else on the other side of the table to you who says, wow, I can't believe this person just like all he cares about is just thinking about good outcomes. He just doesn't respect persons. Like, this is terrifying. It would seem like you would both want each other to kind of meet halfway, and then you could both get kind of the best of both worlds.
Welcome to the Political Philosophy Podcast. I'm Toby Buckle. A few quick updates before we get to today's guest. Firstly, the promised Ask Me Anything episode where I take listener questions. That's still coming. I'm going to release that next week. I just got a whole load of really interesting questions in the 11th hour, and I kind of want to take my time to give a good response to all of those. Next update is I've just launched a YouTube channel for the podcast. So far, what we have is all of the podcast episodes, just audio but with an image. But what's quite cool about having them on YouTube is you can hit CC or closed captions, and you can get a pretty accurate transcription of them as you listen. So you can read as you're listening to them. So what I did is I re-listened to episode 2 with Zephyr Teachow on about 1.5 times to 2 times speed, but with the closed captions on. And that's a different way to listen to and absorb the podcast for those of you who are interested. Finally, I've got a few new pieces of software, and I've worked out how to do a few things technically, which should mean that the quality of the podcasts we're giving you in terms of audio and listening experience is increased to hopefully pretty much a professional level. And I may even go back and, for some of the episodes where the recording was apparently a bit quiet or there was a little bit of background noise, I might try and redo those and put out better quality audio recordings going forward. So, those are the updates. Today's guest I am super excited by, and I was super excited to have been able to get him on the podcast, is Professor Will MacAskill. Will is an associate professor of philosophy at Oxford University, but is best known as the co-founder and president of the Centre for Effective Altruism. So, the Centre for Effective Altruism is what it sounds like. Through organisations like Giving What We Can, it encourages people to commit at least 10% of their income to effective charities. So far, they've raised $1.5 billion in pledged lifetime donations, and they run over 100 effective altruism local groups. Will also co-founded 80,000 Hours, a non-profit that provides research and advice on how you can best make a difference through your career. Will's academic research is in moral philosophy, particularly as it applies to these questions, and he also focuses on moral uncertainty, which is the title of his upcoming book, and the subject of our conversation today. As one final note, I will say that even by the standards of this podcast, this is a fairly challenging conversation, and it's challenging in two ways. It's a difficult and complex subject matter, although a really, really interesting one. And I also realised, re-listening to this interview, that I interviewed Will in a fairly challenging way. To use a sports metaphor, I was throwing a lot of fastballs and curveballs at him, but to Will's great credit, I think he hit back pretty much all of them. And indeed, there's one point where I lose myself and I ask a question which shows that I haven't understood the last thing that Will just said to me. And I included that anyway for accountability purposes. But even though it's challenging, I really appreciated Will taking the time and giving thoughtful, honest replies to really the most challenging questions I could throw at him. And I think the result is really, really valuable. And if it makes your head spin a little bit, then you can kind of learn to love that feeling, and that's part of what doing philosophy is about. So, there's a little bit of a long introduction. I'll pause it there. It is my absolute pleasure to present to all of you Professor Will MacAskill. Okay, so I am joined today by Oxford University Professor Will MacAskill. Will, welcome to the podcast.
Thanks for having me on. It's great to be here.
I've been following your work for a while, and I think this interview is just going to follow up on some questions I had listening to you on other podcasts. Before we get into any of that, do you just want to introduce yourself? What do you do, and how do you think about your role these days?
Sure. So, my name's Will MacAskill, and I'm an associate professor of philosophy at Oxford University. I'm one of the co-founders of the Global Priorities Institute, which does research to try and answer the question, with any given unit of resources, how can we do as much good as possible? This is part of the wider Effective Altruism movement, which I helped to spark, including setting up nonprofits, 80,000 Hours, and the Center for Effective Altruism, and the general theme is trying to work out with our time, with our money, how can we improve the world by as much as possible? Given all the problems the world faces, what should we focus on first?
Cool. So today I actually wanted to talk to you about your latest book is on moral uncertainty, right? Your upcoming one?
That's right, yeah. So it's still a work in progress, but hopefully will be out next week.
Great. So let's cash out moral uncertainty, because there's two levels on which you could have uncertainty in morality. There's uncertainty about what's going to happen in any given action, and then there's uncertainty about which moral theory is right. Could you explain that a little bit better than I did?
Sure. So the first type of uncertainty about what's going to happen, is very familiar to researchers, but also the world at large. We've thought about and dealt with and analyzed this sort of probability all the way back to kind of Blaise Pascal, and even a little bit earlier, in order to work out, especially focused on poker games and other sorts of betting, to work out, how can you get the largest payoff over the long term. And the general idea is just very simple. When you're unsure about what's going to happen, you should choose the action that will, on average, get you the best outcome, average across all the things that you could imagine happening. And so here's a kind of concrete example of that. Imagine you're, driving around a blind corner, and you're deciding, how fast should you go around that blind corner. If you go very fast, then you'll reach your destination faster. That'll be good. But there's some small chance, maybe it's only 1% chance, that there are children kind of playing on the road. And if you hit the child, then that would be extremely bad. You seriously hurt or injured an innocent person. That would be a serious kind of moral wrong. So how should you decide what you ought to do? You've got this potential benefit of getting to your destination faster, this potential cost of seriously wronging. How should you weigh them up? Well, the standard analysis expected utility theory says look at the probabilities of each and the severity of the wrongdoing or the right doing in each case. So we might say, okay, 99% chance of getting to your destination faster. Let's say that's just a kind of +1 in terms of how good it is. Well, 1% chance of seriously injuring a child. Let's say that's minus 10,000. It's much, much, much worse to seriously injure a child than it is good to get to your destination faster. So the kind of morally correct thing, or the right decision, would be to not speed down the blind corner, to take it slow. Because even though you're probably not going to hit anyone, the small chance of a very bad outcome outweighs the larger probability of a slightly better outcome. if you speed round that blind corner. So that's the case of empirical uncertainty, or uncertainty about what's going to happen. Contrast that with moral uncertainty about your kind of fundamental moral values. That's very different, but maybe we can treat it in the same way. So suppose you're deciding whether to eat meat or a vegetarian meal. And suppose you think, well, I've considered some of the arguments. I think it's very likely that animals have just no moral status, perfectly permissible to eat meat. In fact, it would be like a little bit nicer of a meal. Let's say that's +1 in terms of goodness. But there are these vegetarians, and they seem to, have arguments. I'm not completely confident. There's some significant chance that my best guess is wrong, and in fact, it is morally wrong to eat meat. In fact, it's just as wrong as if I was eating human flesh, perhaps. How wrong would that be? Well, it would be very wrong. Let's say that's -10,000. In which case, it would seem like applying the same sort of reasoning that is utterly standard when it comes to uncertainty about matters of fact would mean that in this case, we ought not to eat the meat, even if you're very confident that doing so is permissible, because the small probability of doing something very badly wrong would outweigh the much larger probability of doing something that's probably right. And this is a new application, it seems, of this kind of expected utility reasoning.
So just to make really explicit the expected utility part, this is essentially the way I always used to think about it, and this form of reasoning is really familiar to me because I used to play a whole load of poker. I paid a lot of my student costs playing poker in the poker boom, in fact.
Nice.
And I think anyone who plays poker, whether they know it or not, is using this sort of model in their heads, at least if they're doing it right. So it's essentially saying if you played 1,000, 10,000 hands or iterations of this thing, what would overall be best over a very large or even an infinite time horizon? So you could use an example to explicate it from gambling. I mean, let's just make it a really simple one. You're playing a roulette wheel and you've got good odds. You're betting red and black, so essentially 50%. Every time you lose $1. Every time you win, you gain $5, say. Most people would intuitively want to play that game. But then the feature of expected value that gets you into trouble, or not gets you into trouble, but is really interesting, is that the small probability of a very bad outcome. So if you keep with that same game, but every time it rolls 00, which is a 1 in 30 odds, you lose $1,000, then you'd immediately stop playing the game, even if that's a fairly low outcome. And a similar thing happens in moral choices. Both of the things you just gave are cases of a very small probability event overwhelming your reasoning for the rest of it, right?
That's exactly right. I mean, I wouldn't say it's a very small probability. 1 in 100 happens 1 out of every 100 times.
Right.
That's still, a reasonable probability. And there's all sorts of decisions we make that we do so on the basis of much smaller probabilities. I wear my seatbelt, even though it's probably 1 in 100,000 that I'll actually get into a car crash. So we can be really okay about very small probabilities. But the key insight of expected utility theory is that you need to balance the probabilities of different outcomes with the magnitude of kind of what's at stake, and balance those two.
Which has always been super intuitive for me for day-to-day reasoning, i.e. do you look both ways when you cross the street? But it's always been really intuitive for me, or at least has recently, with political reasoning. Before we get to the moral stuff, let me give you one example of the political stuff where expected utility theory has kind of changed my mind on a political action, which would be foreign policy. So as far as I can see, there's two big existential risks, which even if they're small probability, they're so bad that we'd want to avoid. There's climate change, which will probably be familiar to most people on the left. But then there's the risk of a nuclear exchange or something like that, which tends to lead you in a more conservative direction. And when I started, I've always been very taken by, say, the Noam Chomsky approach to American foreign policy in the last 60 years, which there's a lot of very bad stuff that we'd want to call out there. But if you take the view that even if a nuclear exchange is only a few % probability, it's a bad enough outcome that any decision just has to be assessed in light of, is this raising or lowering that probability? And then a lot of the actions of the American government, you know, in this sort of American imperial era, start to make a hell of a lot more sense if you're asking the question, is this raising or lowering the probability of a nuclear exchange? Now, that's not fully exculpatory. You can argue that even with that view in mind, they're still making the wrong calls. But it really does start to make sense of a lot of American interventions that wouldn't otherwise make sense. And it does seem to be the internal logic that people like Eisenhower, who was a big card player, were using to assess these actions.
So I'd want to distinguish, the concept of expected utility theory, and in particular, the application of it to these, global catastrophic risks, where I completely agree with you that, nuclear war, extreme climate change, global pandemics, potentially other very bad technologies, potentially other technologies with some risks of very bad events. They carry risks that, again, low percentage points of very, very bad outcomes. Most people on the earth dying, destruction of civilization for, removing all of future potential. This is potentially the worst thing we face, even if it's a small probability of that happening. So I completely agree with that. And indeed, I think that kind of reduction of these global catastrophic or even existential risks might be one of the most important moral issues of our time. As for whether that justifies US kind of foreign policy, maybe I'm less clear on that. I'm not, do I think that the invasion of Iraq increased or decreased existential risk?
Probably increased, right?
Yeah, my guess would be increased. There's also, other things historically. Certainly, when nuclear weapons were first developed, there was the proposed Baruch plan that would have put fissile material in the hands of a kind of international body, so that there wouldn't have been a kind of global arms race between Russia and the US. And at least plausibly, that would have been kind of very good, but that didn't happen. And that's evidence that people weren't thinking enough about nuclear war.
I mean, like I say, I don't know if we want to go down this particular rabbit hole. Like I say, I don't think it's exculpatory in all cases. Certainly with the invasion of Iraq, there's no intelligible link there, given that there weren't the weapons of mass destruction. I mean, I do sympathise with the people in the 50s and the 60s when these weapons first came about, because yes, there was some serious proposals to not go down that road, but then two facts: through all of human history, people have pursued superior weapons technology and used it to their advantage. When they do, that just is the trend. And then even if people like the US, the UK were coming to that with good faith, the guy on the other side of the negotiating table was Stalin. And that is a practical impediment to that utopian vision. And I'm sympathetic to people who had to navigate that.
Yeah, and that was why the talks and these plans kind of broke down. There just wasn't sufficient level of trust between Russia and the US.
Yeah.
There are some kind of unintuitive thoughts as well. It's not clear that having 0 nuclear weapons in the world would be safer than having, say, 100 nuclear weapons compared to the 14,000 we have right now. The reason being that, even if nuclear weapons, it can build them relatively quickly. And in fact, if everyone had 0, then one country might worry that another country could build it faster and therefore try and get ahead and build it as quickly as possible and, in fact, launch first. But in general, I would definitely like to see the number of nuclear weapons plummet dramatically.
You could probably, there might be some sort of like stable equilibrium where like everyone had, like 2 people had 5 of them or something like that, which would be a hell of a long way from our world.
It would be very far from our world. But yeah, potentially that's much more stable.
Okay, so moving on then, there's there's that sort of application which, whether or not you agree, and we could probably spend the rest of the thing talking about like the game theoretic stuff to do with foreign policy, nuclear weapons. But then that to me is always quite intuitive, and it's not whether or not it's correct that we're thinking in that way. It's just what the applications are, how you add up the probabilities. But then what you're doing in some of your work and in your latest book is you're applying that to the idea of, is eating meat right or wrong? Is consequentialism, deontology, religion right or wrong? That seems to me much less intuitive. I had one sort of random question for you, which is, what do you think is the strongest argument against bringing an expected utility theory to whether different moral theories are true or not?
It's a great question. So I think there's a few. So one that I know you're particularly interested in is this issue of very low probability theories that perhaps potentially posit very large amounts of value, things are kind of hugely at stake. A second, and that's part of kind of a broader category of just, it might be hard to have low credence in views that are just, even if that like low enough credence in views that are quite crazy and therefore kind of break the whole decision-making apparatus. So in other work, I've talked about theories that think that there's very large amounts of incomparability between different options. It's actually very hard to prevent them from kind of infecting the whole of your decision theory, and just, even if you've got low credence in that view, having the conclusion that almost all options have kind of no defined expected utility. Another kind of class of problems is the problem of comparisons of value between different theories. So if utilitarianism says it's morally right to kill one person to save five, and non-consequentialism says it's very wrong to do so, for which theory is there more at stake? You need to answer that question if you want to apply expected utility theory, but it's unclear kind of what the answer is. So I think the best argument against would be a succession of like technical difficulties in terms of actually trying to apply expected utility theory in this context. So maybe it's therefore misapplication. And then depending on whether you're a glass half full or glass half empty kind of person, you might think, okay, it's just doomed. There's just too many of these issues. I, on the other hand, more sanguine and think of these as bugs to be solved rather than fundamental problems.
So you could imagine, I was thinking of this because it does seem like it does make sense, and the best argument I came up with against sort of using expected value and moral uncertainty is you could just say something like, a lot of these other things, like specifically religious claims come to mind, but a lot of the more extreme deontological claims are just, we are not giving these really any intellectual credence at all. You can imagine someone like the historical Bentham saying something like this. They're just not coherent accounts, and so we're just assigning essentially zero weight to them. Therefore, we don't need to do this calculus. But even that wouldn't get you fully out of moral uncertainty, because there's still, even within consequentialism, a huge number of different accounts and theories and approaches, and you'd still want to weight different things differently between them. You can imagine two utilitarians making different moral claims, right?
Yeah, of course.
So is there any argument against... So even if you were to say, we're just... all of these small probability things, we're just taking them off the table because we just don't think they're that likely, even if you made that move, you'd still be in a world where you were doing some sort of work in moral uncertainty. Is that right? And is there an argument against doing it at all? To just say maybe there is just one approach and we're sticking with it?
So I think there's two ways you could try and have that there's just one approach view. One is if you're what gets called a normative externalist. So on this view, what you ought to do is what's morally correct, and there's no sense in what you ought to do being relevant to the credences you have in different views. So if utilitarianism is correct, then what you ought to do is maximize total well-being, even if that means, even if you think it's very unlikely that you ought to maximize total well-being. And now, I would agree that of course, there's a sense in which if utilitarianism is true, you ought to maximize total well-being. But there's also a sense in which what you ought to do, perhaps it's a rational ought rather than a moral ought. What you ought to do is relative to the degrees of belief you have. And the reason for that is because there should be some sort of ought that's, helping guide your actions. So if you come to me and you're like, well, I've got this really tricky ethical dilemma, maybe it involves some issues in population ethics, it's very hard to think about, and you say, look, I don't know what to do. If I then say to you, well, you ought to just do the right thing, do what's correct according to whatever is the correct moral view, that is just, it's not very helpful, is it? It's not going to help you make a better decision. So that's one way in which, but, there are people who've been critical of the whole project of taking moral uncertainty into account, like Brian Weatherson and Elizabeth Harman, and they defend this normative externalist view. The other way in which you could have this view is by saying, look, moral truths, if they're true, are necessarily true. They're true in all possible worlds. They couldn't possibly have been false. So if it's true that that one ought to maximize total well-being, then no matter what way the world is like, one ought to maximize total well-being. And you could say that, therefore, you ought to believe, to degree one, like 100% belief in utilitarianism, in the same way as you ought to have completely full, 100% belief in 2 + 2 = 4, and if P and if P then Q, then Q. These are just, and perhaps even it's accessible. This moral truth is accessible to us just from the armchair, a priori. And if so, then do the expected utility calculation, but it's going to be very boring because you've only got credence in one moral view, the correct one.
Okay, so I have a question here about the 2 + 2 = 4, and this might be way too meta even for this conversation. But I could imagine another layer still. There's uncertainty about what's going to happen in a given scenario. There's uncertainty about what moral theories are ultimately true. But then I can imagine like a degree of uncertainty in just our overall framework. So I tend to think in a rationalist, analytic, empiricist sense, which I would argue doesn't necessarily lead you to a naive positivism in your applied. The first thing you should learn as an empiricist is really how little you understand of the world. But I'm coming from an analytic approach where, yes, if P, then Q, right? And if something follows logically and, you believe in evidence and so on, and if you really get down to it and say, well, why? I sort of just go, well, because that's where I land, and that seems the only way of thinking about the world that makes any sort of sense. But then there are very smart people in, say, the continental tradition of philosophy or something that seem to be doing something completely different. And what you can imagine, it's not necessarily moral, but an epistemic uncertainty. Should we be assigning weights to the idea that something like the dialectic is true?
So, I think so. What we've been talking about, moral uncertainty, is just one instance of a larger set of questions around normative uncertainty. So that's epistemological uncertainty that you mentioned. There's also decision theoretic uncertainty, which includes uncertainty about how you ought to take moral uncertainty into account, uncertainty about expected utility theory itself. And so the question then, ought you to take that into account too? Uncertainty about whether your fundamental methodology is correct? I mean, I would say yes. Otherwise, it just seems like horrendously partisan. There's these other people who are just as smart as you, by stipulation, who have come up with a kind of radically different conclusions, and seemingly for different methodology. Your brain is just wired in the wrong way. I think ultimately you should, put some weight, put some likelihood in them being in the correct point of view, and therefore.
But then that feels like we're just opening up a rabbit hole that we're never going to return from. I mean, do you ever have that fear that this is just, even for philosophy, if you were to open up epistemic uncertainty, then we're just never getting out from that? Or are you more?
I mean, that is a common thought in philosophy, is that you feel like you're going into a rabbit hole you'll never get out from. I mean, I think the question you've been hitting up against is this question of peer disagreement. So, given that other
Yes.
very smart people disagree with you, well, should you take that view into account? And I think my view is the answer is yes. The way you do so is quite subtle, though. So, supposing you think these continentals are just completely barking up the wrong tree, the naive thing to think is, well, you ought to immediately kind of update, and your views ought to converge to some extent. But supposing that you also think, well, in the future, there's going to be none of these continentals because they're wrong. There's going to be just lots and lots more analytic philosophers thinking in the way I do. Then it seems like you've got a coherent set of beliefs. Perhaps you're not justified in believing that all these people in the future will be analytic philosophers. But it does seem like you're coherent because the vast majority of people are now on your side. And that's what you ought to believe if you're taking peer disagreement seriously. And it's quite subtle that you ought to update not just on, who the people you talk to who disagree with you, nor even all the people in the world who disagree with you, but actually just all people across time, and even all people you could imagine talking with, depending on the likelihood of you talking with them.
But if you do across time, you can imagine a future where a particular set of views became universally accepted that were wrong. That the entire world started thinking a particular way, or let's say the entire world just reverted back to religious fundamentalism. You can imagine that world, but then would that mean we would want to take those views more seriously?
But that's why I think we've got to think about it across possibility space as well. You've also got to think, and how many worlds does this happen? And then you do also, have to consider the question of, are these people your peers as well? So in this case of religious fundamentalism has taken over, you have some explanation which you believe to be of a process that's generated these beliefs that is non-truth tracking. So in that sense, at least with respect to these beliefs, they might not genuinely be your epistemic peers.
So how do you weight, because what I heard you saying on the 80,000 Hours podcast, and correct me if I'm not interpreting you right, is you weight peer disagreement quite heavily against what you'd say the intuitive, or not the intuitive, but the innate plausibility of the arguments. So I heard you essentially saying you're more or less sold on the arguments for some form of consequentialism, maybe not 100%, but like 80, 90% sold. But then once you factor in peer disagreement and the fact that most of your peers are deontologists of some stripe, you pull that number all the way back down to like 50%.
Yeah, that's basically correct. That just doesn't seem wrong to me, or even weird to me. I definitely wish other people were much more were more epistemically moderate or humble too. I mean, in particular, the arguments. The subject matter is just so difficult. I mean, it seems like ludicrously overconfident to have very high credence in a particular moral view. Then I can also imagine methodologies that I don't endorse, I don't find plausible, that I can totally see leading to non-consequentialism. So Frances Cam, for example, who's maybe the arch non-consequentialist, she thinks that what you're doing when you're doing moral philosophy is it's just like linguistics. You're kind of systematizing your model intuitions. And, I don't expect the laws of grammar to be very simple, for example. It would be a very different, working out the laws of grammar is a very different game than working out the laws of physics or the laws of mathematics. And so there are some deep kind of methodological disagreements that you could have that would result in a very different normative or moral view. And for that reason, if I think, for that reason, when I'm trying to think, well, what actually ought my credence to be across different moral views, I can't just think about my own preferred methodology. That would seem a little bit partisan to the way things just happen to seem to me.
Here's why weighting peer disagreement that heavily seems odd to me. And again, there's probably a question we should cash out on: how do we define a peer? Are we talking professional moral philosophers? Are we talking people who think about this? Are we talking all human beings? Are we all talking all possible human beings? But however you draw that circle, here's where it goes wrong for me, is if you take peer disagreement seriously at all, you have to start cashing in religious games at the table. You have to start cashing in religious claims, and religious claims just break the expected value model with a sickening crack. As soon as you grant even a 1% possibility of there being a God and some sort of divine law, that is just going to overwhelm any other sort of more day-to-day considerations. Or, on a more basic level, as soon as you grant any possibility of there being an afterlife, then anything can be justified in light of that. If we are going to be rewarded for all time or suffer for all time because of our actions, then even if that's a really low-order event, everything else falls before that. But then my issue with the idea of, like, sort of peer acceptance is there's got to be some percentage, again, it depends how we define peer, but of really smart people who've thought about this a lot, who really seriously endorse religious claims. I mean, I was just talking to Dale Martin, who's a New Testament historian. Great conversation, amazingly smart guy. But then, do I have to weight those claims when I make moral decisions myself? And if I have to weight them, they're going to overwhelm my moral worldview.
So I think there's two issues to kind of separate, and let's just focus on one, where the kind of idea of, overwhelming your moral worldview, that's going to happen, I think, whatever, or at least it's going to risk happening whatever your view on peer disagreement. So supposing the stakes are literally infinitely great, it's a matter of, heaven or hell. And then suppose your credence that God exists, you don't take any of the peer disagreement stuff. Should your credence in God existing be 0? And the answer has to be no. That's too low. Now, if your credence is 0, then you can also never get evidence for changing your belief. What 0 means is that there's no possible circumstance in which I would alter my belief in any way. But we can obviously think of circumstances in which you change your belief. You come to believe in God, like, booming voice comes from the sky, like lightning cracks down. This happened, like people keep souls going up to heaven and so on. So the credence can't be as low as 0. But as soon as it's, any real number, then once you allow the possibility of infinite amounts of value, at least so the argument goes, seems that that's just going to swamp everything. Because, you think, well, should I go to church, or, should I start trying to convert other people to Christianity or whatever other religion? And you think, well, it's a very small chance this will actually work. Let's say it's 1 in a million and a 1 in a billion chance that God exists. But 1 in a million billion times infinity is still positive infinity. And so that swamps any kind of finite concerns. Now, I think that argument doesn't work. One reason being that the argument that kind of infinite amounts of value swamp just the mere, that certain actions produce infinite amounts of value and others don't, doesn't kind of hold true. One reason is, suppose I drink a beer. Now I've countenanced the idea of infinite amount of values. Maybe and I drink a beer rather than going to church. One chance that drinking a beer is actually the way I get into heaven. Maybe I think it's much, much less likely than going to church. I think it's 1 trillion times less likely than going to church. But now that's still like a 1 in a trillion times 1 in a billion chance of God existing. Any incredibly low probability means that you still end up with infinite expected value. So you've now got this situation where all actions, because every single action has some probability of getting you into heaven, all actions have kind of infinite amounts of expected value. So you now should just be indifferent between absolutely everything. But then it gets even worse because there's the possibility of hell as well. All actions give the possibility of hell. So you've got some number times positive infinity plus some number times negative infinity, your overall expectation is just undefined. So I think the correct lesson from thinking about, religion and idea of God and positive and infinite amounts of value is not that this is an argument for some courses of action over others necessarily, but that it breaks expected utility theory. At least that's how it seems. Yeah, go on.
Yes, but but that's one line you could draw to cash out my intuition that it is a bit different at the moral level than at the practical. Is if you take my example of nuclear war, there's one very, very bad outcome that we would want to avoid, and then it just becomes a practical matter of what are the odds of it, how do we move in the world in such a way as to avoid it, and there could be different answers there. But then if you take the idea of going to hell, it's actually multiple bad outcomes with different ways to them. So there's you could go to hell for not believing in Jesus, you could go to hell for not believing in Muhammad, and the actions you would have to take to avoid those outcomes are mutually contradictory. So you could kind of just say they just cancel out. You can drink the beer or not, and if there's a pathway from both of those to heaven or hell, then it's kind of just the minus side and the plus side, and it maps to zero. But then the problem with, taking a strong approach to what your peers think is the number of people who think going to church will get you into heaven, and the number of smart people who think going to church will get you into heaven is much higher, I would guess, than the number of people who think drinking the beer will get you into heaven. So if you take... If you take the idea of, what everyone else thinks seriously, it seems to get you away from the move which I read you as making, which is that, yes, we want to take these very low things seriously, but they kind of cancel each other out in a sense. That's true if we assume that they're equally unlikely, but then if we take peer disagreement seriously, they're not equally unlikely.
So the point I was making was that at least given standard expected utility theory, even if they have different probabilities of getting you to heaven, they're still infinite. They're still the same.
Oh, I see. Okay.
Expected value, which is namely infinite. Now, you could change expected utility theory a bit because, supposing I give you two options. You've died, I'm St. Peter, we're at the pearly gates, turns out heaven was real all along, and I give you two options. One is a guarantee of heaven. The second is a 1 in a million chance of heaven. Which would you prefer? Seems like pretty obviously you're going to prefer the guarantee of heaven to a 1 in a million chance of heaven. Now, expected utility theory can't handle that. Expected utility theory says they're equally good. They both give you an infinite expectation because 1 in a million times infinity equals infinity. And that suggests that something has gone wrong with expected utility theory once we start thinking about infinite amounts of value.
So then is the bottom line then just infinity breaks the equation?
At least it does for the time being, I think. It does until we've figured out how to really think about dealing with infinite amounts of value. And I think you just get into a huge number of difficult issues.
Would that change if we conceptualized the sort of value of religious claims as very, very large but still finite?
So that could change. That's right. So you could think, okay, it's not we're feeling skeptical of infinite amounts of value, don't know how to handle them. Yeah, suppose it's just some vast amount of value, a Google to the power of Google value. And then, again, I think even without peer disagreement, you have this difficult issue, which is, again, it seems hard for your credence that God exists to get low enough to really warrant just ignoring it entirely. Supposing we think of heaven as a Google to the power of Google, do you have credence 1 over that in God existing? Well, it seems like it would be very overconfident to do so. And I think that's true basically whatever your views of peer disagreement. And there I think we do hit up against, yet again, a kind of deeper problem with expected utility theory. But I think this is a problem in both the empirical case and in the model in the case of decision making under model uncertainty, which is that when you've got these enormously slim probabilities of vast amounts of value, we really do start to balk that this is the right way to make decisions. And note that that's like empirical. Uncertainty about whether there's a heaven is just uncertainty about a matter of fact.
Right.
It's quite different from uncertainty about normative matters, I think.
Well, is there a heaven in theory you could accommodate within a consequentialist worldview? Like, if this is a real place, then that's just a consequence that we have to consider. But it doesn't sound... It sounds like you give a lot of weight with peer review to deontologists who say there are deantic constraints to how we move morally. And you weight that in at something like 30 or 40%, but it seems like you're not weighting the idea of... You're weighting the idea of heaven and hell and God or whatever in, but at some fraction of a percent.
Yeah. I mean, this is definitely something I'd like to think about more. I think, like, people of a kind of scientific rationalist mindset, I think, can be too quick to dismiss certain arguments for conclusions that they have been trained to think are definitely wrong, like the existence of God. Perhaps in the wake of such, so many other views, perhaps you should have a reasonably high credence. I mean, my best view is, my best guess on how to understand the situation, again noting that it's very hard, is just that religious views aren't. Well, two things. One is that they're not necessarily independent. So, supposing that there's 100,000 people and they all believe in this stadium, and you discover that they all believe that, they all believe that the kind of next card I'm going to pull out of the deck of cards is the Ace of Clubs. Now, should I update in favor of that? And it's like, well, you might do so. Like, if they all think this, then maybe they know something about this pack of cards that I don't. But then if you say, well, actually, there was just this one person who believed it, and he cast a magical spell over the entire stadium, then the fact that it's 100,000 or 1,000,000 or 1,000,000,000 just doesn't matter at all. There's just kind of one initial cause. So in probability terms, these people they don't have independent judgments. And I think you could argue the same with respect to religious views. So, there's just this, kind of one book, one line of evidence. Many religious people aren't forming judgments on the basis of, or at least to the same extent, on the basis of independent kind of assessment of evidence. So therefore, they're kind of, for that reason, the kind of scale of the peer disagreement might not look as high, might not actually be as high as you might think. The second, I'm going to mention kind of a couple more. Second, then, is just, again, whether you regard people as peers, if people also have various empirical beliefs that seem very implausible, which, at least for biblical literalism, is often going to be the case. There, again, you might be warranted in, on those grounds, kind of not regarding other people as peers, or at least within that kind of constrained area. And then the third is when you actually do think about disagreement, not just across all people in the world, but into the future again. If you think, well, I expect, even, assuming the future is a rational place, I expect most people to be non-religious, then at least that's a coherent set of beliefs. So, I do think the issue is actually very hard. I think harder than most people give it credit for, but I think it's at least plausible to think that your credence ought to be very low, even while taking peer disagreement very seriously.
So, as a final topic to end on, what's the sort of cash value of this moral uncertainty way of thinking? Because when it comes to religious claims, it seems like we're sort of on the same page, with you just having thought about it more than me, that we grant there to be some possibility, and it would be weird not to, but we're not really going to let that possibility govern our moral decision-making, at least most of the time. Whereas that's not the case for all views, right? Like, you, I think, would want to say that there are times when you would take a moral point of view. Well, let me just ask that as a question. What are the times that you would take a moral point of view that you would get to on the basis of moral uncertainty, but you wouldn't have got to on the basis of consequentialism?
Okay, terrific. Yeah, I think the key, maybe there's two key aspects. So one is violation of side constraints. So, should you kill one person to save five, or harm someone for the greater good, and so on? Should you flame an innocent person in order to prevent a riot? All these classic counterexamples to consequentialism. I think under moral uncertainty, you ought to be pretty wary of violating side constraints for the greater good. Don't think it's absolute, but I think it moves you much more towards a kind of threshold deontology view. I think it's plausible that the non-consequentialist thinks it's very bad if you kill one person to save five. Thinks it's much more wrong than the utilitarian thinks it's right to kill one person to save five. So that's kind of one class. The second is then kind of considering bearers of value that I might not think otherwise has value. So the natural environment, for example. I think, on the moral views I find most likely, there's no intrinsic value to the natural environment. There might be strong instrumental reasons for preserving it, but nothing intrinsically valuable about biodiversity or preservation of natural habitat. But there's these other people who disagree with me, so I should end up placing at least some intrinsic weight on such things. And then in terms of like the overall view, I think this is like part of it. And then I think from the other side, the non-kind of consequentialists should think that in terms of our positive reasons, our reasons to do good, well, they think, well, how you spend your money, your charity, your career, that's just kind of like up to you. It's like morally permissible either way. Whereas the consequentialist says, well, it's really, really important to ensure that you're trying to use this to do as much good as possible. And so I think that side of things strongly supports the consequentialist view. And then in particular, I think it supports really worrying about these, global catastrophic risks or existential risks that we talked about, just because the amount of value lost into the future on those views that really value the loss of future people as almost, as bad as deaths. Well, that's just hundreds of trillions of people into the future if the human race were to go extinct soon. And therefore, I think on the consequentialist part of the equation, ensuring that we preserve the human race into the future becomes absolutely crucial.
Okay, I've got one follow-up. We're coming up on time. But my one follow-up would be, is if you take a case like, do you frame an innocent man to prevent a riot that would kill 10 people? I mean, I would argue that there's a sort of way out of that without moving into deontology or even moral uncertainty at all, which is just the move from act to rule utilitarianism. You just say, well, overall, we want a functioning justice system, and that would be what would maximize utility overall, and people will then try and come up with examples about, but what if no one knew, and what if it didn't affect the overall enforcement of the rule, to which my answer would just be, sure, but that's not how real life works. Like, in real life, the best you're going to do is just the enforcement of a set of rules, a set of norms, a set of laws and institutions. Can you think of an example? So I think there's examples of moral rules that can be justified both deontologically and as an overall way of maximising utility. Something like a prohibition on torture would be a good example. But then I think there's moral rules that actually can only be justified deontologically. So the idea of retribution or punishment, I think, I find it difficult to see how you get to America's prison system from utility alone. I don't think you can. So do I, by your view, if there's one set of rules that you can get to really from just consequences and utility, how far do I need to be taking seriously? Is there any examples where you would take seriously a rule that can only be justified deontologically?
Yeah, I mean, I think, it depends exactly how you flesh it out, but like I mentioned, kind of preservation of the natural environment or something. I do agree. I do agree that it's this very notable fact that the things that non-consequentialists tend to say have intrinsic value or intrinsic wrongness are very suspicious insofar as they are very often also conducive to generally improving well-being. And those cases where they aren't conducive to well-being, actually they seem kind of suspect, like instances of, moral purity, like the prohibition against homosexuality that they used to be.
But then, in those cases, do you just not want to say, well, there might be some probability that you're right, but it's not really high enough that I'm going to take it particularly seriously?
Oh yeah, that's exactly what I think about in that case. I was moving away from moral uncertainty and just onto the object level point that one of the things that makes me suspicious about non-consequentialism is that the things they seem to promote are so often also things that are just good from the perspective of, making the world a better place.
And when they are,
in terms of
when they are promoting rules that can't be justified non-consequentially, they seem to be, I think, never mind punishment, desert in general, good people should get good things, bad people should get bad things, seems to be justifying all sorts of horrible conditions for the quote-unquote bad people, and then on the flip side, all sorts of levels of wealth inequality that you'd never get to from consequentialism alone. And I don't know, I don't know how seriously we should take that view. It's a majority view, even within academia, that desert plays some role, but I don't know. I think if I'm maybe just a bit more of a philosophic meathead here. I'm almost just of the point of view that if consequentialism doesn't get you there, then actually the onus is on you to say what does get you there and evidence that.
Mm-hmm. I have some sympathy to that in terms of, moral intuitions that people have that I deeply lack. The idea of desert is just, I've never found any of that compelling. But I think, imagine someone else on the other side of the table to you who says, wow, I can't believe this person just all he cares about is just bringing about good outcomes. He just doesn't respect persons. This is terrifying. It would seem like you would both want each other to kind of meet halfway, and then you could both get kind of the best of both worlds.
But it sounds
you could avoid the most egregious wrongs.
A lot of where you're coming from is a sort of respect of persons. If you're sitting in the room with someone, you'd want to be careful with how you've said it, and you wouldn't want to just say, well, you're a moral imbecile. You wouldn't want to put it like that, right? But that's sort of a question of tact and manners. And then, as a matter of practicality, if we have to sit down and decide what social policy is, you might advance utility more by granting some weight to desert in order to find a compromise. But as a sort of what is ultimately morally right? Just to stick with the desert case, I've never seen anything plausible there other than just, well, I don't like these people and I want them to suffer, or I do like these people and I want them to be rewarded, but that's really insufficient.
You did mention that majority of people in academia think that that's plausible. I'm not sure if that's correct. I might just be biased in the people I know, but it seems like the idea of retribution as a justification for punishment, at least within philosophy, seems to be quite a minority view.
You might be right there, but on the positive side, the desert plays some role in allocation of resources on the positive side.
Again, I would think it's a minority view, but
really?
It's definitely not zero. I know that some people do think, yeah. But again, I might have a very biased sample because...
I feel like in political philosophy, desert does quite a lot of work. You're the academic. I'm more than happy to be corrected on this one.
So, there's the whole field of luck egalitarianism, which does, build in desert into part of the kind of very notion. it's never clear to me whether political philosophers are trying to kind of carve normative reality as joints or not. Are the principles they're giving meant to be, yes, this is the fundamental moral principle, or is this meant to be more like the principle that society ought to kind of live by, which is more moving into what you were calling the rule consequentialist kind of justification again.
We're coming up on time, but what sort of weight, if you're giving like 30-40% weight to deontology mainly on the basis of like peer views, how would you weight desert in at the table?
So yeah, maybe I put that like 10% or something.
Oh, okay. So like we want to look at it a little bit, but we're
I'd need to think. That's right. Yeah, I'd need to think about how much would that change kind of concretely. I still think punishment and reward are just even. I have exceptionally deep disagreements with the current prison system, especially in the US. But I still think that punishment and reward is like going to produce kind of better outcomes, at least under some formulation, because of the incentive effects and so on. So I'd need to think about cases where that really makes a difference. But I'd want to, it would at least get like a little bit of weight. Perhaps it would always be outweighed by, so if I think, I really ought to punish the bad person, well, that's always going to be bad according to, the views on which just making someone worse off is bad. So in cases where there's no, incentive or signaling effects, it's possible it would just always be outweighed by the larger proportion of my credence that thinks, it's very wrong to harm someone merely for grounds of retribution.
Yeah,
that's definitely possible.
So in cases that are like drug use or sex work or stuff like that, then when it's victimless crimes, as it were, there's really the idea that these people need to be punished.
That's right, yeah. So someone has been caught for possessing marijuana. There's some portion of my credence, according to which is very low, according to which possessing marijuana is wrong, and one ought to punish people who've broken the law. But there's like a larger portion of my credence which says it's wrong to punish innocent people.
Right.
It's wrong to harm innocent people. Or it's wrong to harm people if there's going to be no kind of good consequences from that.
So if that's
it's plausible it just always be up.
So if that's on the lowest end, final question, on the highest end would be something like protection of the natural world in terms of some sort of deantic constraint. What deantic constraint would you let your consequentialism be overwhelmed by?
Well, I mean, I think, you've said, well, there are these good rules, keep promises and don't harm other people. I think, it would just be very surprising to me if the non-consequentialist and the consequentialist agreed in every case, even when we're going around in the real world. Like, the rules that you would come up with that are justified on consequentialist grounds, they're still going to look pretty different from like the non-consequentialist rules I would expect.
Can you give an example of a non-consequentialist rule which you would your hunch would be you can't get to that through consequentialism, but you would still grant a lot of credence to?
I mean, okay, actually, here's a kind of better one. This is maybe, again, you could build it into value if you want, but like kind of obligations to your friends and to your family. At least the utilitarians is going to say, like, look, it's just all the same. Whereas, I'd want to give, like, at least, I'd want to give some extra weight to, like, taking care of friends and family.
That's
going to be like a clear kind of difference.
Yeah, because there might be some second level utility principle whereby it is good to have those preferences for overall societal well-being, but that's kind of weak. I think we would want something a little bit stronger than that for like...
Yeah, I mean, you could say that, well, you should really look after your friends and family because you'll, burn out over the longer run. in terms of your attempts to do good and so on. But they start to have the feel of kind of apologia rather than genuine justification.
Yeah, that I think the friends and family one might be a good... I mean, you might be able to mount some sort of argument to the effect that the world is better if everyone in the world has like 2 or 3 people who really love them in a way that they couldn't love everyone in the world. But again, that's still comparatively weak compared to like... There's all these things about like, you know, your wife and the guy who's going to cure cancer are drowning in the river and you can save one. Like these horrible things philosophers make us think about. And I think we'd want to say, at the very least, that is a hard decision. And you'd never get to that being a hard decision through consequentialism alone.
Yeah, exactly.
Okay.
Okay, well, thanks so much.
Yeah, thank you for coming on. Yeah, anywhere you'd like people to follow you at?
At Will MacAskill on Twitter.
Excellent. Thanks for your time, Will.
Okay, thanks so much.
Thank you for listening to the Political Philosophy Podcast. If you're enjoying episodes like these, the best thing you can do to support the show is by helping us build our audience. We've seen some really good growth in the number of our followers recently. If you could help us continue that, that would be amazing. So any shares, any forwards, tag friends who you think would be interested, that would be amazing. And a big thank you to everyone who's already done that. Next week's episode, as mentioned, is going to be an Ask Me Anything, where I take audience questions. And I'm going to make that available both as an audio podcast like this, and also as a video which I'll put on our YouTube channel. So if you want to see the video version, subscribe to us on YouTube. The links to that, as well as our Facebook, Twitter, iTunes, are all on the website, politicalphilosophypodcast.com, politicalphilosophypodcast.com. So go ahead and check that out, subscribe to any or, all of them, if you're so inclined. And yeah, thanks again for listening, and until next week.